Welcome to Roundhill Radio. Through our conversations, we discover the holy and the ordinary, look for moments of grace and peace, and redefine what we talk about. We talk about faith. Good morning, Ed.
Good morning, Leslie.
Back together again.
Back together.
In the same room.
Yes, here we are. Back in the studio.
Back in the studio. So we are anticipating this Sunday being Pentecost. And I was trying... yesterday.
Go ahead, fess up.
To explain Pentecost to somebody who didn't know what it was and hadn't.
How'd it go?
I mean, magnificently bad. It was so, it's like, it's kind of a wild story to begin with, right? And so.
Sort of.
And it just, I was like, so there's the Spirit, and then I had to back up, and I was like, well, you know about the Trinity and the three.
Oh, wow.
And I quoted you because like the three expressions of God, and there's this, and that went fine because I had language from you to lean back on. And then I was like, but there's a fire, and there's, it's not fire, and then there's wind, and then they're like all speaking in different languages, and that's basically where I gave up.
Yeah, it sounds perfect.
It was great. So, can you save me and help me so that I can try this maybe again later? So let's start with the obvious question of what is Pentecost?
What is it?
What happened? What's the deal?
You know, I have to say, first of all, it's a miracle that, Christianity has evolved for 2,000 years with trying to explain these various, holy days and holidays and what they might mean, and the tremendous amount of blood spilled over their meaning.
Yes.
Over the years, right?
Well, thank goodness no one was relying on me to do it right, because that would have, yes.
So Pentecost, there are supposed to be these three great festivals of the Christian year. Right? We've got Christmas and Easter and Pentecost. But, Pentecost cards are not really as popular as the Easter and Christmas versions. So
yeah, it's not really been embraced by popular culture.
It really has not.
There's no
Easter egg equivalent.
All I can think of right now was a Pentecost raccoon. I don't know why. Because there's always an animal, right? I'm looking at the Easter bunny, and I'm like, a Pentecost raccoon.
Perfect, right? I'm sure. Look, raccoons seem to be on the rise these days.
Dude, I have heard this to be true.
Yes, so I think that maybe there's a place for them in all of this. When you think about having religion is such a fragile thing these days anyway, and then having to explain, something that's supposedly very important to the life of the church, and that's as complicated as this.
And it also, thinking of it from sort of a more secular mindset, Pentecost to me, actually weirdly, maybe it's just I'm not as used to it, or it's not as familiar, clearly, is that it seems sort of the more far-fetched to me, which if you think about Christmas and Easter obviously have miracles, and for some reason those are easier to kind of summarize.
Yep.
Versus something today that sounds there's a little more like religious fervor involved, which makes me kind of feels like a little bit of a hot potato.
Yep.
So it's a very interesting, how do you explain it?
Well, let's see what we can do with it.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
We'll come back to ground here, see if we can see what we can do. One of the things I've actually thought about Pentecost. So first of all, this is related to, it's an agricultural festival in its origin, right? So it's supposed to take place, it did take place 50 days after Easter. So you get this penta, meaning the 50. So the 50 days after Easter, that's actually an important season in the Christian year, but it more or less is neglected. So we have Easter, it's very exciting, but then we tend to move on to other stories and things. We don't think about it as a season unto itself. So the season of Pentecost, you have this festival related to, it's an agricultural festival. So you've got people in Jerusalem who were apparently from all kinds of different places. So you got a very diverse population. And then all we know, it seems, is that something happened. And a lot of language gets used to describe that. It was like having this very flame-filled event, right?
Yeah.
Where all of these different people with all of their different languages are actually able to understand one another, which is a beautiful image when it sounds bizarre,
Yeah.
but it also sounds beautiful in the sense that now people can speak across languages. And when we think about how difficult it is, when we think about how polarized things are today, politically especially, that we cannot even speak a common language.
Right.
But the celebration of Pentecost is actually being able to understand one another across difference, which I think in and of itself is a beautiful thing.
Well, because I'm used to sort of hearing the story in such a way that like everyone starts speaking in tongues.
Yes.
Which is to me kind of almost the opposite of this. Everyone has diverse language. Everyone can understand each other. That to me feels a miracle and beautiful and unifying versus kind of this more individual experience of of faith.
I like that. Yeah, it's definitely a community event, and it's a diverse group of people who are learning to listen to each other across difference and speaking, and as you say, even speaking a language that's not common, which is this speaking in tongues. It's a spiritual language, right? And actually, there's a technical term for it. It's glossolalia. Which is a great word, I think.
Great word. I really like that one a lot, yeah.
So it's as if there is, in the midst of all of these people, underneath it, there's another language that they can speak, that they learn how to speak at this time. So I would just also take one step back from this to say that there is something that Christmas and Easter and Pentecost all have in common, which is the presence of the Spirit. So when Gabriel says to Mary, you're going to have this child, it's because of the Spirit that it's going to happen. And that's a specific reference. At Easter, it's the Spirit of God that has this resurrection power. And the people who are the disciples, the other followers of Jesus, they experience the Spirit. He breathes his Spirit into them at Easter. Another reference to the Spirit.
Right.
And then you get a third reference to it in Pentecost. And I think where the challenge starts to come in, it's almost as if someone said, so artistically, how would you portray that Spirit?
Right.
How would you portray those different languages? And then it's as if this individual flame, rises up in the lives of each one of these persons who are gathered. And it's a beautiful image. And there are a lot of old artistic depictions that show all these people together with like a little flame above each head, So it's a dramatic, artistic way of talking about inspiration. We use the phrase like, wow, that person is on fire. Right. And I think that's what's going on there.
Okay.
Those people are really on fire with something. In fact, they were so much so that they were accused of being drunk. Right? Now that's a part of the story that's pretty grounding. And so, it's so funny because Peter, one of the disciples who's there, he says, no, it can't possibly be that because it's only, 9 o'clock in the morning. And I'm sorry, but Peter, you've got a more noble picture of humanity than I do.
One of the disciples probably too.
People can get started pretty early in the day if they need to. So anyway,
funny.
that's not a very good defense. But I guess the point is that they are intoxicated. But they're intoxicated with a spiritual energy that makes them look like they're on fire, that gives them access to a language which they don't normally access. It gives them the ability to understand, right, across differences. It makes me think a little bit of a movie years ago, and I think it might have been called Phenomenon, and it starred John Travolta. And I think it starred John Travolta. And he's a man who lives in a community, and his life doesn't seem to be distinguished in any particular way, except one night he comes into contact with some kind of unidentified flying object. And for just a moment, he's bathed in its light. So this would be a little like being on fire. And then the light goes away, and whatever that ship is, it goes away. But he develops these extraordinary powers. And they're not of the superhero variety. They have more to do with learning languages, being able to do computations, very complicated computing in his head and those sorts of things. But they're almost Pentecostal kinds of things that he does. And I think that's what's happening here. The story seems to be saying that the Spirit is giving these people abilities and capacities which aren't quite superhero powers. But today we like to use the phrase, right? What's your superpower,
Right.
And so they do get a certain kind of power, but it's more about understanding and community, basic things that make the world work. Those are kind of the gifts of Pentecost, but it's just layered in all of this other imagery. And so we have to keep translating that in order to make it feel like we can enter the story. Does that make sense?
It does. It's way better than I did.
We all do the best we can,
So just a logistical follow-up question, because I'm always fascinated by this. So this is an experience of the disciples.
And others.
Was this, by our best understanding, the same year that Jesus had died?
Yes.
Okay. So this was legit. This was 50 days, or we're celebrating it 50 days.
It's happening soon after. Yeah. But the number of people, there were a lot of diversity of people and more people than the disciples, which I think is a way of saying that the energy that was part of the Jesus movement initially, it's already spilling out into the wider world.
So they're already going out there and
they're already on their way
doing stuff.
Yeah.
The disciples. So you had some thoughts about the disciples and waiting.
Yes.
That ties in with Pentecost. What are those?
Yeah, kind of a little sidebar thing. Or maybe it's not a sidebar thing. Right?
We'll find out.
We'll find out. So what do you do when the leader of the movement dies? That's a shocking moment. That's traumatizing. And so they are kind of betwixt in between. He's died, but the stories of the Gospels indicate that they have experiences of meeting him after he's died. I actually think, in many churches, those stories get way underplayed because nobody really knows how to talk about that.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
It's like talking about phenomenon. Oh, I was bathed in this light from a UFO, and okay. But these stories were clearly very important to the disciples. Right? So the question is now, Jesus has died. Yes, some of them have experienced him. Not everyone, but some of them have. And they are trying to regroup and resettle themselves. And then they get antsy. So, what do we got to, we've got to do something. Right?
Yeah.
We've got to act. What are we going to do? And so at the beginning of the book of Acts, the advice that's given to them is wait. It will be revealed, and you'll know it when it happens. When the next thing that you're going to do, it'll become clear. And the phrase is wait for the promise of the Father. That's what it says. So it's not necessarily Jesus, it's God who's going to indicate what they should be doing next. So then what do? Okay, well, they clearly meet in each other's homes, it seems. They have experiences of sharing meals together. That's very important. And they're instructed to go to the temple, actually, and continue to worship there. So that all seems very standard. And I think it's too standard for them. So like they said, what are we going to do?
Right.
And so because there were 11 of them, because Judas is dead at this point, having betrayed Jesus, he's no longer part of the 12.
Is he actually dead?
He's dead.
Really?
He's dead, yeah. And so he is completely out of the picture. And this is where tradition steps in. And they said, we've always had 12. And we've got to have 12 again.
Right.
And so how are we going to do that? Well, they have a kind of I think they have a pool of candidates. And they go through this very sophisticated process, which is basically choosing lots. To say,
eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
It is not very, sophisticated. But they do choose a man whose name is Matthias.
Matthias.
And that's the last we ever hear him.
Poor Matthias.
Right. And so in this,
pick last for the baseball team. I mean, really just.
Oh my gosh. Right. I mean, he's our 12th guy. I mean, so there's a wonderful book by Andrew Root called When Church Stops Working. And he does have a little meditation on this. And he said, I'll do apologies to Matthias, who was probably an amazing man in many ways. But when did you ever hear of him again?
Right.
Because this was something that the church rushed out to do and wasn't the most effective thing that they probably could have done.
Because they felt like they had to.
Right? And churches these days, being as jittery as they are, often feel like we got to get moving, we got to do stuff.
Right.
And we've got to do the stuff we used to do and, all that. And none of that's working, by the way.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
So basically Matthias, who knows what happens to him. But I think they do eventually summon the courage to wait. And because they keep waiting, then there is this explosion of energy, which we call Pentecost. I think the way that scholars look back at this time is that something dramatic happened in the life of those who had been following Jesus and were trying to figure out what to do next.
Okay.
And I think Pentecost is the very visionary, artistic, poetic way of describing what that was.
Okay.
And that's why we get inclusions of flames and speaking in tongues and the glossolalia and all of that. Those are very powerful images to say something both powerful and very mysterious happened.
Okay.
And it was spirit driven. It wasn't manufactured by folks. Right? It's kind of like in life, you do something and you think, I didn't really do that. Like, it was like something happened through me.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what happened to them, except and you mentioned this earlier, it happened to them. It was a community thing.
Yeah.
It wasn't just happening to individuals.
Right.
And that's a great, I think, learning for the church of our time is that we have tended to privatize spirituality,
right?
But we're meant to be learning congregations, learning communities where we learn together, experiment together, receive the Spirit together. And I think that's what's happening at Pentecost. And it happened eventually because they were able to wait for it to happen.
To wait for it to happen. And that togetherness, as we are in the month of teamwork.
Yes, we are.
In our What Matters Most series. I try to bring it back. It makes me think about some of the best projects I've been part of have been made better by the conversations about them. Bringing in making them a real team effort and really leaving. To me, I've noted in the past, I feel like my early career was very much like developing my skills, finding my confidence, finding my systems that work. Like it was very like me focused, like really trying to become the professional I wanted to be when it came to music, when it came to proficiency at the keyboard, when it came to working with choirs and all that stuff. I feel like now something I've been trying to do is intentionally leave a blank in whatever I'm working on.
Love that. Oh, great image.
So that I think that would have given me great anxiety in my 20s. Of this like, I didn't do it. I didn't finish it. I didn't do it right.
Yep.
And now I'm like, I gotta leave something because I think there's also a sense of like, I don't have to do it all. And maybe I don't have 100% of everything I need to make this the best it can. So there's some humility fighting its way through there, which is a nice, refreshing thing for me. And it's just like leaving a blank space for other people to then bring their magic into it. We're working on a project right now for our online worship service. And I was very much like, here's what I'm thinking. And here it was like a big blank space. And I gave you kind of like, in video editing, there's an in and out. You kind of these like little bookends. And so I was just sort of like, here are bookends.
Yep.
And there was just some gesturing.
Significant gesturing.
And I think that's the really cool thing about, people say leaving room for the Spirit and
Mm-hmm.
creating this thing. I think you have to be really intentional about that, though. I don't think it just sort of happens.
I agree. I was listening to two colleagues talk recently. They both are manuscript preachers. So they have full manuscripts that they use when they preach. However, they have said as they've gotten over the years, they leave deliberate spaces in the manuscript.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that. They don't know what's going to happen there.
Yeah.
And maybe nothing will happen and they'll just jump from one part to the next. But leaving those open spaces it creates room.
I like that.
Right?
Yeah.
I think, there's also this tradition. I've seen Navajo carpets, weavings, and there's always this sense that there is a strand that doesn't connect. And it's meant to actually leave an open space, kind of an open space for the Spirit to breathe in it. And it's not absolutely essential. In fact, it's to be avoided that it be perfect.
Yeah.
We want things to be perfect, and we put ourselves under tremendous pressure.
Yes. Yes, we do.
And what happens when they're not perfect is that, according to this philosophy, is that you're leaving room for the Spirit to come through that. It's an acknowledgement of our own imperfection, and that's okay. It's completely understood.
Yeah.
So I think what you're doing is wonderful. There's a thought that popped into my head as you were talking about, building your craft and doing that over time. Now, when we hear you lead the choir, when you are playing on Sunday morning, those of us who get to be on the receiving end of that, I think, I won't speak for others, but I'm pretty sure this is true. It's almost like there's a sound above the sound that gets created. It's like there is another presence. It's very difficult to describe, but when we're caught up in the music, it feels like something is coming through the music.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a very powerful experience. And I've certainly felt it as I've listened to you and listened to the choir. So I think that's that under reality. That's not even the right word to use it, but what it is, it's a beyond that comes through the here and now. And I think that when you've worked hard at your craft to develop that, it creates the space for that. So yes, there's imperfections in us, but there's also the working at the craft.
Yeah.
And just being faithful to it, using the materials at hand. And to me, that's a very powerful experience. And I know that others feel that as well and experience it.
Oh, thank you so much for that. It makes me think of a Yo-Yo Ma quote, which is, I'm going to butcher it, but it's basically saying that people ask him why he still practices because he's Yo-Yo Ma. He's like,
yeah,
he's brilliant when he wakes up in the morning. But he said something to the effect of he practices so that when he is performing for somebody, he's not worried about it because he can't sort of transcend the music if he's worried about the music.
Right.
And that always really stuck with me because it's, practicing is not my favorite part of being a professional musician. And so I think that has stuck with me recently. I wanted to loop back a little bit to something you said about preaching. And the people are dying to know. I can feel you asking the question, dear audience, of Ed, what does your manuscript look like when you're preaching?
Oh boy.
Is it a picture?
It might as well be. My son Kyle used to look at manuscripts that I had created, like notes and things, and just think, abandon hope. All ye who come, arrows and asterisks, and
is it really?
I have moved beyond that. That I couldn't do that anymore. But yes, there used to be all these little things going on. But it can vary a lot, and all the way from sometimes I will use something that's pretty close to a manuscript, but sometimes it's fun just to take two music stands and put two words on a sheet of paper on one music stand and two words in that, and those become like the bridges
Cool.
You know, you sort of get from here to there. Okay, we made it that far. Let's see if we can get over here, from there to there. That's actually an idea that I picked up from a friend of mine, Bob Seaver, years ago. And he said, you know, you may not need much.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I think it also, the thing that speaks to me in this is that we can tend to over prepare.
Sure.
And there's something about over preparation that is not helpful to the spirit. You know, it's as if we've become too focused on the thing at hand,
Right.
and we're not free enough or limber enough or open enough to let the other energies come through. So, they can vary from week to week. But I love an ellipsis, those little dot.
Great.
Because if I have 3 words and an ellipsis, it's like somebody gave me the little push out of the gate. And then after that, I don't know where it's necessarily going to go.
It's your runway?
It's my runway.
Nice.
Yep. And once I have that, then it feels like, well, let's see what happens in the moment. And then it also, I think, gives whatever interactions happening with the congregation, that can be part of that as well.
Because we do a online worship service and an in-person worship service, and you record the online 2 or 3 days ahead.
Yep.
Do you find by Sunday, what's your experience preaching again? Because we've traditionally been a single service church. I think we've both worked in churches with multiple services where it's like you hear the same sermon 3 times in a row in the morning, but not usually like 3 days apart.
Right.
So what's it like on Sunday? Are you finding new things? Are you kind of like editing as you go? What's that like?
You know, sometimes I want to apologize to the online audience. Or maybe I want to say thank you so much for bearing with me on this, because I was still working it out.
Finding my way through.
Oh my heavens, So actually I'm finding myself, it's evolving, and I find myself making more changes in the last few months. I don't know why that is the case.
Yeah.
But I'll feel very satisfied with what the online service is going to do, right?
Right.
But it's almost gotten to the point where I think sometimes the service on Sunday is a different sermon entirely. Yeah. It can sound very similar, but there are some key differences because I've had that extra few days to say, well, what if I just push that more in that direction? So it's basically the same, but moving in a different spot.
Yeah.
But that's a very interesting question, because yes, we do. It's, we have a short run up for that online service.
Sure.
But as I've mentioned to you, I also have found that incredibly helpful, because once that's completed, yes, some new ideas may occur, but what an incredible grace it is to actually have a Saturday for the first time in my life.
What are those?
What are those? I'm almost living in a state of shock because of it. So anyway, it's been great.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah. So I think that's part of my experience there.
Yeah. That's I always find that really interesting, because it's, the distance of time when we create something and then we go back to it is always it's always kind of a weird thing, because, you're kind of looking, it's almost like you've taken a snapshot of you, where you were that day, and that week, and mindset and the weather and whatever. And then you kind of go back to, you're like, well, I feel like a different person.
Right.
Or something's happened.
Yeah.
And you've had an interesting conversation with somebody or something.
Oh my gosh.
So it feels probably like you've lived a year since you recorded that thing 3 days ago.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Oh, it's so true. And there can be moments, I think we all experience this when we're leading worship, whether it's, you doing what you're doing and I'm doing what I'm doing, where something happens between the time you've just finished your rehearsal with the choir.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it shifts your whole perspective over in this direction. And then you have to get back up in front of them and do everything that you're doing, but your mind has shifted in that time. It's a bizarre experience.
Or sometimes I'll be leading rehearsal and we'll be going through something, and I'll look at what I've scheduled. I'm like, what was I thinking? What was 3 weeks ago me? Was she okay? What happened? But in the time, it made perfect sense. So it's always interesting to like look back and be like, well, that was an interesting choice I made.
Right? Yeah.
Okay, well, it's in the bulletin, so that's what we're doing. So then we try to find something in it that's
which one of me did that?
Yeah.
It's an amazing experience. Well, maybe it's the spirit keeps moving, right?
Yeah.
It's restless in that sense. And maybe the kind of thing we want to think about with all of these experiences, I go back to the opening verses of the book of Genesis, right? So you have a creation, which we're not even sure we can call a creation. It's described as waste and void, right? So it's just, who knows what it is. There's a deep darkness. And the story says that the Spirit was hovering over the waters. It's as if it's looking, it's waiting. How am I going to make a start here? And it's such an amazing moment. It's one of my favorite passages. And I think that's what our lives are like. We're hovering over an idea or over the next Sunday or however many other Sundays. And we have to eventually settle down and make a decision about what needs to happen. But from the point where you made that decision 3 weeks ago to now, you're like, I feel like I'm a really different person. Who was that did that?
It's sort of funny because I always wished I was the person that could like plan out an entire year of music all the time. There are so many directors of music that do it.
Oh, bless their hearts.
I also think they're dealing with lectionary, so it's a little bit easier. I'm just saying.
Okay.
I think it's easier.
With you.
When I was in college, I was working with this amazing director of music, Catherine, and she and I used to sit out on her deck in the summertime and just like go through anthems. So I have a very, very warm memories of that. But it's just like now I'm like, so much is going to change. I can't really, because I'm just going to have to change it again.
Yeah.
So why spend the energy right now?
Sounds like a perfect approach to me.
Yeah, it works. Well, because, it's nice to have a starting place.
Right.
But
the Pentecostal spirit prevails.
I'm leaving room for the Spirit is what I'm doing. And if you ask why I haven't done it, because I'm leaving room for the Spirit, Krista.
Well done.
The angel that is Krista that is patient with me and being like, I don't know which hymn. I'll figure it out.
Oh, gosh.
This has been a wonderful conversation.
Great conversation.
I feel like I understand Pentecost so much more now.
All right.
So thank you for that. I'm going to go try to explain it again. Wish me luck. And we are also grateful to you for joining us for this conversation and for all the rest. Round Hill Radio is brought to you by the friends and members of Round Hill Community Church. For more information, please visit roundhillradio.org.
If you enjoyed this podcast, there are a few things that you can do that would make a big difference to us. Like the video, subscribe if you aren't, and click the notification bell and select all. Thank you.